Let's go ahead and move on to Ukraine. Some fascinating stuff happening here in Washington. There's been some major debates. Counterpoints did a great job covering it. But we have an update on the Democratic front. For a while, Krystal and I have been asking, we're like, hey, where is the anti-war movement? Like, does it even exist? So yesterday, heartened to see a letter. Let's put this up there on the screen. This makes it actually bipartisan in terms of criticism of the war. 30 House Democrats, mostly of the House Progressive Caucus, led by Representative Pramila Jayapal, called on Biden to pair their unprecedented economic and military support with, quote, proactive diplomatic push, redoubling efforts to seek a realistic framework for a ceasefire. That's it. If you go ahead and you read their letter, it is one of the most innocuous things possible. They do not call into question ongoing arms sales to Ukraine. They do not say that the U.S. should force the Ukrainians' hands. They do not say many of the provocative things.
They go out of their way,
yes,
clearly, to not say that with reassuring language about, of course, it's up to the Ukrainians, and of course, we see Russia's not good actors here. Of course, we know this would be very difficult, but maybe, kind of, sort of, we should consider possibly thinking about diplomatic action.
That's it.
That's basically the letter.
That is all they say. And I will read you the conclusion. In conclusion, we urge you to make vigorous diplomatic efforts in support of a negotiated settlement and ceasefire, engage in direct talks with Russia, explore prospects for a new European security arrangement acceptable to all parties that will allow for a sovereign and independent Ukraine, and in coordination with our Ukrainian partners, seek a rapid end to the conflict and reiterate this goal as America's chief priority. That's it. That's all they said. Frankly, innocuous, not particularly groundbreaking. Many much more provocative things have been said on this show, of which, you know, the pro-Ukraine people have been upset about. That's fine. You could be upset about this, but I don't see how this is anything not within the bounds of public debate. And yet, the freak out that this letter caused in Washington is unparalleled. And especially because they're on the Democratic side and they're much more susceptible, I think, tell me if you disagree, to criticism from elite media circles and all of that.
100%.
They caved within a matter of hours. That letter came out in the afternoon, 4 to 5 hours later. Put this up there on the screen. Pramila Jayapal go ahead and issues a statement. She says, in a letter to President Biden, my colleagues and I advocated for the administration to continue ongoing support. Let me be clear, we are united as Democrats in our unequivocal commitment to supporting Ukraine in their fight for democracy and freedom in the face of it. Diplomacy is an important tool that can save lives, but it is just one tool, as we also made explicitly clear all of that. I mean, it's a total capitulation where they came out and just said, actually, no, we didn't mean it, and actually, we're 100% in line with President Biden, and please don't criticize us anymore. We're not anti-Ukraine. We really just want democracy. It's just hilarious and pathetic to watch this real capitulation in real time.
I mean, just instant, right? And I was tracking because even as like moderate and carefully worded and milquetoast as this thing was, I was like, this is 30 Democrats. They're not all squad members, you know, AOC and Cori Bush and those folks, Ilhan, they were on it.
Yeah, that's right.
But it was also these sort of like more Jamie Raskin and other sort of like mainline
Sheila
figures.
Jackson Lee from Texas.
Right. I was like, okay, all right, we're at least opening up a conversation. And I was shocked because I knew they were going to get massive backlash because, you know, we see the way that this all unfolds. There is zero room to question the direction and the strategy whatsoever. Zero, okay? So I was truly surprised, and I was truly impressed.
Took courage.
I was truly impressed. Ro Khanna is the only person that I've heard saying really any of that before this letter comes out. And then I start to watch online. In fact, while we were planning our show, I was looking at the replies and the quote tweets from all of the blob-aligned, mainstream, resistance. All these people just went all in, piling on these people. Even some of their fellow members of the quote-unquote progressive caucus, like Ruben Gallego, going all in, trashing them. They're being accused of being Russian stooges. Marcos Malitsis accused them of making, quote, common cause with Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene, J.D. Vance, and the rest of the MAGA crowd. All of this just absolute vicious attacks on these people, questioning their motives, questioning their intelligence, questioning the timing of the letter, everything. And almost instantly, they completely cave. It's so depressing. It is so incredibly dispiriting to see that you can't even open the door a crack to saying maybe we should think about diplomacy to end this war. And Ryan Grimm, I think we have this. Let's put this up on the screen. Of course, our Counterpoints co-host here, he had a great article breaking all of this down. He says 30 House Democrats tried to gently open the door to diplomacy in Ukraine. It was slammed in their face by the end of the day. And he goes into some of the pushback that we saw online and on cable news and in other places. He goes into the timeline of how instantly Pramila Jayapal in particular just completely caved. And it's utterly pathetic. He quotes here Eric Sperling, who's executive director of Just Foreign Policy, which had endorsed this letter. And he actually made, I thought, an interesting point. He cast the extreme opposition to it as a sign of the fragility of the anti-diplomacy consensus. He says the shrill response to this utterly moderate letter exposes that war proponents are scared of an open debate about the range of potential approaches to addressing this conflict. As happened with the war in Iraq and many others throughout human history, war proponents attempt to silence debate in large part because they are not confident in their arguments and they are afraid that pro-diplomacy views will appeal to average Americans. And that's exactly what we have seen when the question has been asked. There is a large majority of people who are interested in diplomacy. Because guess what? If we want this war to end, that's the way that we're gonna, I mean, even if you imagine, which most analysts don't say that Ukraine, even if we, continue to arm them, most of them don't think that they can outright win and push Russia all the way out of their territory. But let's say, okay, maybe they could. Do you really think that Vladimir Putin is just gonna sit back and accept defeat without somehow escalating, without some sort of desperate moves, without creating some sort of chaos and catastrophe? Because I sure don't. So the idea that you can't even say this without being viciously smeared and attacked online and accused both of being, Russian propagandists, but also the ultimate sin of having anything in common with, people who are supposed to be out of bounds, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who I'm no fan of, who I think is a ridiculous person. But you can use that hard partisan divide to just shut people up. It's so disgraceful. I can't even wrap my head around it.
I mean, honestly, I am finding some comfort in this, Krystal, because I am just seeing that there is a massive political hole waiting to be filled that will one day make its voice heard by the democratic process. Americans are not stupid. The closer that we get to nuclear war, they're going to say, hell no, we're not interested in this. The establishment and the Ukrainians have made a tremendous error in allying themselves with the mainstream Democratic Party, which is about to get its ass kicked in Congress. And guess what? House Republicans, there's already a civil war that is erupting.
That's right.
Put this up there on the screen, which is that Kevin McCarthy came out and said to Punchbowl News, actually, we are very likely not to approve any more aid to Ukraine. Now, they used fiscal language in order to say that, and whatever, I mean, I guess, better than nothing. But Mitch McConnell said, no, that's not going to stand, all of that. Now, listen, do I think Kevin McCarthy will actually have the stones to stick by his position? No. I think he'll probably cave to the blob as well. But what it does show me is that if the pressure is on enough to McCarthy for him to publicly come out and to question the Washington consensus, imagine what a Donald Trump-like figure, who we showed you is already advocating for negotiation and diplomacy. Let's say the war gets even hotter ahead of the 2024 election. Remember, everybody thought that Americans were going to freak out when Trump was calling out NATO allies. Didn't happen. Everybody thought that the Americans were going to say, my God, he's questioning the free trade consensus. Nope. Actually turns out that they support it in wide numbers. So listen, they have ceded the ground for the debate to the fringe and to Donald Trump. He is not a fool. Trump, if his greatest skill is intuiting which areas of public consensus and rhetoric are completely out of the bounds, seizing onto it and hammering it home and hammering it and pissing off the establishment who screech and make the issue even louder for Americans who love to see them melt down. So the Ukraine consensus of February of 2022 is long gone. Go ahead and take a look at every poll that exists. GOP voters are split right down the middle on continued aid for Ukraine. Every Concerned Veterans of America poll that we've ever showed you has shown a tremendous preference for diplomacy. Right now, the entire Ukraine debate really is shrouded in secrecy. They don't want people to know. And look, you know, we're not stupid. As many people could watch the show, as many people watch the news, most Americans have no idea what's going on in Ukraine. They have no idea how close we are to a Cuban Missile Crisis. I said this before. I believe one of the most shameful things that Joe Biden has done is to tell a bunch of rich Democratic donors that we are on the verge of nuclear Armageddon. And if you believe that, you owe a direct address to the American people to tell it. But he can't tell you that, because if you do, you're going to be like, well, hold on a second then. What are we doing about that? Yeah, like, are we gonna stop that? He would prefer everybody go about their lives and go to the gym and, you know, argue about inflation or whatever, because the longer that happens, Washington is allowed to continue doing what it wants. It operates in secrecy, and yet they never learn their lesson. They didn't learn it from Iraq. They didn't learn it from Libya. They didn't learn it from Afghanistan. Americans will make their voice heard eventually in some way, and you are not going to like it when that day comes.
That's right. And the instinct to just completely shut down any discussion. Like, there is literally, you are not allowed to dissent even 1 inch, which is effectively what this letter was.
Yes.
This letter was like 1 inch of dissent, and they had everything thrown at them to shut them down. And, you know, they instantly cave. And this is a repeated problem, obviously, with the, you know, so-called Progressive Caucus, where they cannot take any heat from Democratic leadership, from the mainstream press, from freaking, you know, idiot pontificators on Twitter. They can't take it. They just instantly fold. And so it is really depressing. Ro Khanna did have a decent statement even after everybody else around him capitulated. He said to Ryan, it should not be controversial to say we need to explore every diplomatic avenue to seek a just peace and to end the war, including the engagement of our allies to help with that. He's right. It shouldn't be controversial, but apparently this is, you know, considered completely out of bounds to even have the conversation about a diplomatic end to this war when the president of the United States is openly admitting that we could face potential nuclear Armageddon. And yet we're still like, yeah, this direction we're going in is fine. And you can't even question it. You can't even say anything about it. You can't even suggest at all a different direction. It's so depressing to me. I wish they just wouldn't have said anything.
And let's show them why. Why did this happen? Put this up there on the screen from the propagandists over at the Washington Post. Here's the headline: Why Putin Hopes for a GOP Victory, as explained by a top Russia expert. This was the prevailing consensus all up and down the line in terms of the elite press, because if you suggest anything even close to diplomacy, you are a Putin asset. I have no love for Vladimir Putin, okay? I don't want to die in a nuclear Armageddon. I want America to survive and to be better off. I don't think that has anything to do with Vladimir Putin. I don't get to exist, sadly, in a world where he is dead and doesn't exist. We have to accept terms on which they are. We can hope for many things. I hope for a world with no war, but I'm not an idiot. You know, it's like one of these things where we have to accept the reality of the conditions as they exist in terms of their nuclear power status, in terms of what their red lines are. These are not things that we necessarily should be happy about. We have our red lines. They've been very clearly articulated. It's called NATO. Anything outside of that really is up for debate. This is the part of the thing that drives me insane. Whenever they say, well, if we capitulate in Ukraine, what will stop us from capitulating in NATO? NATO is a Senate-ratified treaty. The president has no authority to even withdraw from it, even if he wanted to. If they attack NATO, we will be in a nuclear war. If they attack anywhere outside of NATO, we have a choice. If we have a choice, we should probably do anything humanly possible in order to make sure that we don't make that does not occur. We had a play of this in the Cuban Missile Crisis. We had a play of this in Korea. I wish for the days of statesmen who had to confront the reality of war. We had 3 successive presidents that faced a nuclear crisis: Harry S. Truman, Dwight D. Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy. All of them were forged in the crisis of World War II. Truman backed down and fired MacArthur because he feared that war over Little Korea would have a conflagration. Basically pursued a strategy which may not have been best on the battlefield. This is controversial, according to MacArthur, but had an overarching diplomatic aim of, I do not want to confront the Soviet Union. Same thing with Dwight D. Eisenhower. They wanted him to use nukes or threaten them in the Suez Crisis at Dien Bien Phu. He said, you're out of your mind. I've been through this. I'm not going to happen. John F. Kennedy, the exact same. I fear that our politicians have just been so far removed from the reality of what a global crisis actually looks like, that's the cavalier nature of why elite media, too, whose sons, of course, have never served in the military or have any, generational connection to this. They have no idea. I just watched All Quiet on the Western Front. I urge all of you to watch it whenever it comes out on Netflix. I saw it in its limited theater release. That's what war looks like. People dying up until the last minute of the armistice for some scrap of France which was turned into mud. That's the reality of what this situation is.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's so much fuzzy thinking here. People love their simplistic narratives. And I get it. The Ukrainians are the good guys, and Putin and the Kremlin and his allies are the bad guys. Like, no disagreement here. But give me some sort of logical endgame that makes any kind of sense, that doesn't end in complete catastrophe for the Ukrainians, for Europe, and potentially for the world. Give me some logical step-by-step. How do you see this thing ending? They never tell you that. They never get to that point. And I think, even though obviously we're very clear and very passionate about our own perspective on how this should all play out, I think we have tried to hold space for what the opposing view is, what the opposing arguments are. And I fully admit it is a complex situation, and the idea of giving into any of Putin's demands or desires here, it is terrible. It feels terrible. It doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel just. I get that instinct and I get that perspective 100%. All I'm asking is that you also allow space for people to have a different view of the best way to approach this conflict and not accuse them of being in bed with this bad actor or this bad actor, or being Kremlin stooges, or being friends with Marjorie Taylor Greene, or whatever. Allow people to have a dissenting view. And then guess what, guys? Those who are such big defenders of democracy, allegedly, why don't you let the voters hear out that fulsome debate and see what the American people think about this?
Yep.
Because I do think Sperling is 100% correct here. The vehemence of the reaction against such a totally tepid, reasonable, couched in a million different phrases and language letter, the reaction to that is incredibly telling of how fragile their position really is.
I completely agree.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.